Classes in session.
How you doing? Welcome to Unlearn 16 Classes in Session today. I am so incredibly happy to be joining what is this? The screen, the audio, the whatever, the podcast space with Femi Oluwole. No,
Oluwole.
Oluwole. Gosh. You know
Sorry,
what?
no,
And I'm
no,
not even
nobody gets
cutting
it.
that out. I'm embarrassed, but I'm not even cutting it out. This incredible gentleman is a political activist in Britain. I'm going to say a political activist because social media just like puts you on, the
Everywhere.
international stage, and your focus, your underlying focus, is sort of a pro-European Union, anti-Brexit kind of stage. And you created something called, or you co-created an advocacy group called Our Future, Our Choice. You're an activist, a commentator. I see you on British television all the time. And obviously, you're huge on Twitter, which is how you and I met, which is such an amazing platform to connect just similar thinkers all over the world, which is incredible. So, Femi, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's fantastic. So maybe, and we're going to get into a little deep into politics today. For those who are listening, we're going to get into politics. We're going to have to get into economics. And I know that's like a 4-letter word to a lot of people, but trust me, the political elite like to make it that way. So you tune out, in my opinion. And then we're going to talk a little bit about human rights and sort of make connections with what's going on when it comes to Brexit, what's going on when it comes to the United Kingdom, the United States, and obviously even Canada. The world at large, but I think, that sphere of influence is probably a great place to start. So for those listening and who have no idea what Brexit is, because they've just heard it or seen it and kind of understand it, can you give us sort of a general definition of what it is, why it went through, and sort of your perception on that?
Okay, so Brexit is a shortened version of saying British exit. So the British exit from the European Union. The European Union is 28, well, it was 28 countries in Europe, and they basically work together to make laws together. They have easy trade between each other, no tariffs, no taxes on products that cross between the different borders, and they also make laws together in the European Parliament. Which means that, for example, if those 28 countries had to make their own laws separately, if you wanted to sell, let's say, I don't know, beer to 28 different countries, but they all made their own laws separately, then you'd have to make your beer compatible with 28 different sets of rules. So because they make laws together, it lowers the prices for those manufacturers, which therefore lowers the prices for consumers, and just basically makes life cheaper and improves the quality of life. Now, the idea behind Brexit was, we're Britain. We want to stand on our own. We don't want to have our laws made in Belgium and Brussels. We want to make our own laws separately. Now, the problem with that is you therefore create that barrier in terms of having to make different products for different places, and it adds to the cost. And we're starting to see some of those problems coming out now.
Now, when we talk about, like, let's say, because let's get out of the way, because they're going to have maybe some people on here confused, or B, very much fundamentally against sort of the foundation of the European Union. So if I was advocating against it, let's say I would say something like, okay, fine, we have a European Union, we have a European Parliament. Who chooses those parliamentarians? So how is the European Parliament chosen? Who's going to make supranational laws?
So on the European Parliament, there are a bunch of different bodies that make up the main institutions of the European Union. One of them is the European Parliament. That's made up of 750, well, it was 750 members of the European Parliament, and they are elected directly by the people of Europe in European elections every 5 years. And so they're the ones that are ultimately the ones who end up passing the law. But the origin of those laws comes from, first of all, you have the European Council, which is basically all the different heads of government of different countries. So it was the UK Prime Minister, the French Prime Minister, etc., and they'd all meet together and decide the general direction of the EU every 6 months. Then that would therefore get taken by the Commission, and the Commission would then come up with laws that match up with what their general policy direction was. And once those laws are made, they then get sent to the Parliament. The Parliament will change them, edit them a little bit, and then decide whether or not they get passed and become law at the end of that.
Right. So there is a democratic tie coming from each European nation to elect those individuals every 5 years. So for those saying, look, we've just chucked democracy out of the window, that's just not true.
No, in fact, one of the weird things is because the European Parliament ultimately has the yes or no say on all the laws that the European Union makes, and because the European Parliament is elected proportionally, so by a proportional system, so there's no like electoral college, it's just
Right.
you get a proportional share for each party based on the number of people that actually vote for each party. Unlike the UK, which is a lot more like the system in the States, we actually have more democracy at the European level than we have at the UK level, and unfortunately, things have gotten even worse.
Right, right. And I think therein lies, I think we just hit the head of the problem is the idea that a proportional system allows for a more democratic, more comprehensive form of democracy, which means, Femi, all of those people that used to be in charge, that used to steer the ship, that still do, depending on how they fix, let's say, riding associations or whatever in the UK, in the United States, even in Canada, because the same thing happens. Those people are getting, is it fair to say, those people are getting pushed out? Those people are getting less control. Do you think that's a big push about for Brexit, like coming from a governmental standpoint?
I think that the where we are now, I think the people definitely feel like they have less power and less control over politics than they did before. Largely because, well, where we are now, we have a government in the UK that has a majority of 80 MPs, roughly, and that's despite getting only a minority of the vote. So, for example, in the UK, the Conservative Party got 44% of the vote at the last election, and yet they ended up with 56% of the seats in Parliament. And if you've
Yeah.
got 56% of the seats, you can pass any law you like without having to even argue with the other parties, which means that the votes for all those other parties, which represent 56% of voters, don't count. The vast majority of votes do not mean a thing in the UK politics right now.
Hmm. So, just for our listeners, again, a lot of Americans are probably going to be listening to this. The UK and Canada are both parliamentary democracies, which is different than the United States. The United States is a republic. Now, I don't know how a quick way to explain this, but there's a difference between obviously a majority of votes and a plurality of votes. So, how many parties do you have in the UK?
Oh, there's about, I'd say, I think that if you look on the list, it's about 100 in total.
Okay,
But
how many? Let's say how many competitive parties? Yeah.
competitive parties. So you've got, if we take it down to vote parties that have more than 2% of the votes, I think that down the bottom you've got the Greens, you've got the DUP, which is a Northern Irish party in Northern Ireland. You've got Plaid Cymru, which is a party in Wales, the SNP, Lib Dems, Labour, and the Conservatives. So about seven or so.
All right. So in Canada, we have 4 or 5, given
Mm.
where we are. So what ends up happening, and I'm going to try to explain this. But what ends up happening, and everybody can kind of, I mean, see this how this could happen. If there's 100 votes and you have 7 parties, not a
Mm.
single party may ever take the majority of votes. But just
Yeah.
because they don't take the majority of the votes doesn't mean we don't allocate and we don't assign a party that wins the most votes, and then their leader becomes, prime minister, leader of the government. So that's basically what's happening in in Britain, and it's definitely what's happened in Canada. I mean, we have an Ontario government that got elected with a majority of power, Femi,
Mm.
17% of the vote.
Jesus Christ. That's worse than here.
That's the appropriate response. Jesus Christ. There's no other response other than that. But that's what happens when a chunk doesn't vote. So you have that. And that's what happens when you have such a significant split and a riding system that's sort of taking advantage of that, right? So in England, how would you say, or in the UK, how would you say it was framed? How was Brexit framed? Because it was voted upon, right? How
Mm.
was it framed to the general population of people living their everyday lives?
So there's two ways of in terms of how it was framed. There's how was it framed in terms of ideology and what people wanted to get from it, and there was
Hmm.
how was it framed as an actual technical concept of leaving the EU. As
Hmm.
far as the technical concept of leaving the EU goes, that was one just major con, because ultimately when you say leave the European Union, international we're talking about international relations here. So an international relations runs on treaties between different
Right.
countries.
Right.
And so our relationship with the 27 other countries of the EU was defined by the treaty of the European Union. That's what set out the rules and obligations and how the EU worked. And if you say leave the EU, you have to have a different relationship with the EU afterwards. So you need a new treaty. And that's what we spent 3 years after the referendum negotiating. But that wasn't known at the time of the referendum. So it was like saying, I want, we 48% want the status quo, the relationship we currently have, and 52% want something else. And that something else hadn't been negotiated. So I often say that it's like signing a contract that says leave the European Union and then letting the other side of that contract
Blank.
add 1,000 pages of extra terms and conditions to what you signed 3 years later and say we already got your consent. Which is
Hmm.
why what happened at the end of those 3 years is that you had the literal Brexit party, led by Nigel Farage, who's like our far right populist over here, saying that in a referendum between Remain and Boris Johnson's deal, Remain would win every single time. So even Nigel Farage had rejected the end product. So had the DUP, and even Boris Johnson has called his own deal unfair after the election. So you ended up with
Sure.
an end product that nobody actually wanted, even on the winning side. And
Right.
so that's why from a technical standpoint, it was a con. It was a bait and switch. We vote to leave
Hmm.
the EU and we give you something that you don't actually end up liking. From a ideological standpoint, Brexit was framed as giving power and prosperity and well-being back to ordinary people.
Hmm.
And if you often when I speak to people in London who voted heavily to stay in the EU, they don't understand how anybody could possibly have voted leave. And so I have to tell them, look, imagine if you live somewhere in the north of England. You
Yeah.
live in an area that has had no investment for generations. When you
Hmm.
were 11, your dad lost his job because Margaret
Coal
Thatcher closed
mine.
the shipyards.
Yes.
Exactly, coal mines.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so you've always hated the Tories because of Margaret Thatcher.
Hmm.
Um, and so you've always voted Labour because of how much you hate the Conservatives. But in your area, Labour always wins, the Conservatives always lose. So neither party actually has any incentive to make your life better.
Hmm.
You're completely forgotten. Your vote doesn't actually mean anything because everybody knows which way you're going to vote either way. And so you've watched London get more investment every year, Millennium Dome, London Eye, underground tube system, train system. Um, but nothing for your area. And the one time that your vote might make a difference is the EU referendum, the Brexit referendum. And in that referendum, the person telling you to vote for things to stay the same, for status quo, is David Cameron, our Prime Minister at the time, who had just
Yeah.
put you and your family through 6 years of austerity, so cuts to welfare, cuts to benefits, cuts to health services for 6 years after the financial crash of 2008. And he's the one telling you to vote for things to stay the same. Under those circumstances, unless you're an expert in how the EU works, I can very much understand how anybody in those situations would want to vote for change and vote for things to get better. Unfortunately, we can all see that it's only made things worse.
Right. I mean, God, I feel like that's just the underpinning of politics in general, isn't it? I mean, you, we have a very similar, I don't know how much you know about Canada, but we have a similar internal struggle where we have one province, Quebec, who's wanted to separate for some time. And funnily enough, we had a referendum on that back in the 90s. Now, the funny part is that when I explain the Quebec referendum and I explain it just like you did, you know, they voted, should Quebec separate? That was the question. Go ahead and
Mm.
vote. But nobody said, when you separate, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this, right? Nobody said that. No. And I, when I'm teaching this concept to the kids, I'm like, guys, it's like saying, do you want to move out of your house? You're 16, do you want to move out? And you're like, yeah, I want to move out. Well, in one condition that you've fashioned in your head, your parents are going to buy you a condo, give you an allowance, have somebody come over and cook and do your laundry. That sounds nice. Under those conditions, you want to separate. But if it's the actual conditions where you're going to live in the back of your car that you had to buy, no, I'm not too interested in moving out under those conditions. So it's the same thing. Here's my question. What is the motivation? Like, because I've really tried to understand this, other than garnering the perception of power, because that's the only thing I can come down to. What do you think the genuine, not the public, because the public, in my opinion, was misled. What do you think the genuine drive of the politicians that stood on side of Brexit? What was their motivation, do you think?
So there are some politicians who genuinely believed in Brexit and wanted Brexit because of for ideological reasons. So Nigel Farage would be one of those people. Jacob Rees-Mogg would be one of those people who genuinely believe, because of their sense of nationalism, because of their sense of British superiority, that Britain standing on its own was always going to be a good thing. That Brexit must be a good thing because we're so special.
Right.
However, for the majority of politicians, if you look at Boris Johnson himself, who was the poster boy for Brexit, in 2000, what are we talking? 2011, he said in front of a stage, he said that London owed its economic success to our membership of the EU single market. And he said that he can see no circumstances, in my view, why any future prime minister would ever change that position. So he then became the prime minister that took us out of the EU. In 2013, he said, I'd vote to stay in the single market. I'm in favor of the single market. I think we should be able to trade freely with our European friends and partners. So this is somebody who is documented as knowing that leaving the EU single market would damage the UK.
Yep.
And in 2016, he actually wrote two separate articles, one in favor of leaving the EU, one in favor of staying in the EU, and basically weighed them up. In fact, you can actually find the original article in favor of staying, which makes all the stuff that we all knew would come true and has come true. And he
Right.
chose the one that would end up getting him into number 10, into Downing Street, becoming prime minister. So it was pure self-interest, ambition, the desire to gain power.
I, I find that so insane. I can barely, comprehend it. But you said two very well. I mean, one very important word, and I think, um, and this is the concept that I'm going to draw back to the United States. I'm going to draw back to Canada, because this is the word that I've never liked a day in my life. And right now, it's being only used to propagate and push and hold up fascist principles. And the word is nationalism. I think this word is, I've never liked it. Anybody says, "Are you a patriot?" in that aggressive kind of way, I'm like, "Oh
Mm.
God, no, no, no." And anybody who says, "Well, we want Britain to stand on their own. We want Britain out of the EU," my answer to them is, "Where do you think that's happening? In what world is any country right now, besides maybe North Korea, and let's be honest, they're not doing it so well, standing on their own? In
Yeah.
what world is any country an isolationist, independent country who doesn't have to take anybody else into account when making, national choices?"
Yeah.
And I find that hilarious. And the more that I hear guys like Trump or people in Canada speak about this nationalist platform, and we have to take power and it's all within, I'm like, who are you? You're obviously lying. You know you're lying, but you're also convincing people that somehow you have the authority or the power, the all-encompassing power to control what goes on in your country. And I think that's what Boris sold to people. Am I wrong?
Yeah.
Like, he
No,
sold that.
yeah. So it was what he sold them was an outdated notion of countries standing on their own. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
back if we wind back the clocks hundreds of years, and every country was in it for themselves. There's very little trade between them. It was like all the countries an enemy. And that's the sort of mentality we're talking about. But if you look at where the world is now, If you look at Canada, if you look at America, they have a relation. They have the NAFTA, or I'm not sure what the new name for it is now, with
Yeah.
Canada and Mexico.
We ignore what Trump renamed it because he's just annoying. So we always talk.
Okay, NAFTA, because you need to trade properly with your closest friend, closest neighbors geographically, because all countries trade most of the countries that are physically closest to them. If you look at, you've got the African Union. If you look at the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, if you look at
There
the
we
fact
go.
that Australia gets about a quarter of its food from China. People always trade geographically. And given that the biggest barrier to trade is having different regulations, having different laws, it makes sense to have similar laws with the rest of Europe. And now we are the only country, well, roughly the only country in Western Europe that doesn't have the ability to trade with the other countries in Europe without any of those restrictions, which
Mhm.
essentially gives us a competitive disadvantage in the region that we trade the most in.
Right.
And that is the core problem. And you mentioned nationalism, and that is very much what it is, because the narrative that was sold to people in 2016 was, we can leave the EU, but we'll still have the ability to trade just as freely with the EU, because we'll be able to set the terms of our new relationship, because the EU need us more than we need them. Now, just
Oh,
break
right.
down that concept for a second. The EU, which at that time would be 27 other countries, need
Yeah.
our one country more than the other way around, which implies that, I mean, just the idea that one country losing trade with 27 countries would hurt them more than those 27 countries losing trade with one country. It's mathematically insane, and implies that British people are inherently better than European countries by a factor of 27.
I'm better than everybody by a fact. I like that T-shirt. I like the irony
Yeah.
of it.
Yeah.
We should make those, sell them everywhere. Um, it's asinine, and not only is it asinine, but what it does, and this is the thing that I think is so interesting, because we've seen this time and time again, right? We've seen this. You mentioned Margaret Thatcher. Well, Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister of Britain. You had Reagan in the United States. You had Brian Mulroney in Canada, and you had this trifecta of these very conservative slash social programs, trickle down economics, right? You don't just see waves of politics affect country A, you see waves of politics affect world countries, especially when they're very closely interconnected. And they use the same mechanisms, because we see it right now, heaven help us. You use the same mechanisms to get at the same type of population in your country. You mentioned all the disaffected people of northern, let's say, more northern England, right? Places that they
Mhm.
haven't seen investment, places where manufacturing's gone, whether it's as old as coal and steel or just straight up manufacturing. Well, God, I can't help but hear the ringings of truth when you talk about Trump saying make America great again. I'm going to
Yeah.
get those. He reopened coal mines.
Yeah.
The dude just wanted to or pretend, and that's the reality, to say places like Michigan or places where are were heavily dependent on manufacturing that went away because of trade agreements with other countries. I'm going to somehow bring them back, knowing full well there was no hope of that ever happening. Because you can no longer, when you have an international economy, your manufacturing in a developed high economy nation is not going to be able to compete with, let's say, manufacturing in China. You're going to lose.
Yeah.
It doesn't even make sense. Of course, you're going to lose. Everybody wants their $5 T-shirt. It's not being made in Poughkeepsie. It's
Hmm.
like New Jersey, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But nonetheless, you're right. And it's interesting because a lot of people get really angry at the right. They get really angry at conservatives, and I'm assuming the same is true there. I get mad, but what I try to remember is this, or what I'm trying to remember. How do I remember where they sat and the desperation they must feel? Number 1. And then I remember how much education, because we're talking about concepts and about economic theory and about interconnectivity and globalization, that a lot of people are like, I, I worked
Yeah.
in a GM factory for 25 years, not because they're not intelligent, but because They were never given those kind of educational, inclusive terminology. So they can't connect to it. And then you have somebody coming along saying, your life sucks. Your life sucks. And I'm going to make it better. And I'm going to make it better by bringing jobs back. But we're missing, I think, the final point. And I think England does this. And I'm going to ask your opinion. We're missing the final point, which is your life sucks. I'm going to fix it. But I got to have somebody to blame.
Mm-hmm.
So in Trump's US, he blames Mexico, which is hysterical. But he does it well. He does it, and it to those people, they're like, he wants to take care of me, and he says it's their fault. So we need to handle them, because I think a big element of Brexit, and please correct me if I'm wrong, was culturally, racially, isolationist, was driven by the fact that we want Britain to look a certain way.
Yeah.
And it no longer looks a certain way.
Yeah.
Now, because of the EU, you have free migration of all of these people, right? Do you think that kind of prejudice and that kind of discrimination was at that underpinning of the driving that ideology?
It was definitely the case for a lot of people. I just want to circle back quick to what you said about how the nationalism was interconnected, and it happens with a lot of countries that have close ties. There was a point, I think, about 2017, 2018, where in the Netherlands, in United States, in the UK, even in France, you had a blonde, ultra racist fascist trying to get power. It was Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. It was Marine Le Pen in France. It was Donald Trump in America. It was Boris Johnson here, and all with the same rhetoric, preaching to the people that have been left behind. And you're right; they're not stupid. I mean, often they use the claimed accusation that people are calling them stupid as a sort of tool.
Yeah.
Like anybody who questions why did you vote Brexit, or this isn't going to be good, automatically you're calling them stupid. And I make the point, look, I studied EU law in 2 universities in 2 languages. I worked in Brussels in the EU institutions for 3 years inside some of the institutions, and even I didn't understand how Brexit would affect, say, Northern Ireland. I was embarrassingly and shamefully clueless on how that would affect the peace process there. And so it's not about stupidity. It's about, have you been exposed to this? I happened to get lucky on the subject that I studied,
I don't know
and
why
it put
I can't
me in a
hear
good
you.
position.
And welcome back. Do I think that we got shut down by pro-Brexit forces in the UK just then? There was a whole bunch of technical difficulties. I think we touched a nerve, Femi. I think
so.
we touched a nerve.
I think that's it. I think that Boris Johnson basically got angry with what we were saying and cut the wire.
He did. He did. I think he called Zencaster, and I'll be talking to Zen. I'll be having some words later. But hopefully I've inserted an appropriate, and hopefully I did this, so if I didn't, I apologize. But I'm going to insert a commercial right in the middle there, and I'm going to make it really funny. So hopefully everybody's paying. It may or may not be directed directly at Boris Johnson. We'll see.
So where were we?
we?
Yes, isolationism and how nationalism is spread across the globe. Yeah, so as I was saying, it's weird. There was a moment between like 2016 and 2018 whereby it looked like you were going to get a blonde crazy racist in America, a blonde crazy racist in the UK, a blonde crazy racist in the Netherlands under Geert Wilders, and in France via Marine Le Pen. And so it was crazy how they all seem to be syncing up, all tapping into the anger of people who've been left behind by the system, all tapping into poverty, all promising a better life, all promising to change the system, even though they are the elites they claim to be against. And then you mentioned how people who buy into this, they're not stupid. They've just been left behind. And I often you'll hear the accusation, oh, they're calling you stupid whenever you try and criticize their ideology. But that's just it's the thing is, often Remainers were painted as thinking they were more intelligent, thinking they're the educated ones. But the fact is, if you haven't studied EU law, then you don't understand Brexit because it
Right.
is a very complicated issue. I
Yep.
studied EU law in 2 universities, in 2 languages, in 2 countries. I worked in Brussels in the EU institutions for 3 years, and even I was shamefully ignorant about how Brexit would affect Northern Ireland. It just
Hmm.
didn't come up. So there's loads of stuff that you might not know, which doesn't make you stupid.
Right.
And you also mentioned how these populists they'll try and blame certain parts of society in order to further their narrative, and that is very much what happens, and that's how the racism creeps into it. You'll have the most deprived areas of a country, and you'll have these far right people going to those areas saying, "Hey, the reason why you're not getting what you need is because that person's taking your job, that person's living off benefits," and they'll try and point the anger at anybody except the fat cats who are actually running the show.
Hmm.
Anybody except the fact that you've got these people. I mean, right now we're having a leadership election to decide the future prime minister of the UK, and it's being decided by Conservative Party members. And the
Yeah.
polling of those Conservative Party members shows that 63% of them are ideologically against redistributing wealth from
Of
the
course
from
they
the wealth from the wealth from the rich to the poor.
do.
They don't want to solve the problems that their party was elected to solve.
Yeah. I think that it's interesting and painful, I think, at the same time, because I look at, this the narrative where it's like, we're here to help you, we're here, and then the pull yourself up by your own bootstraps kind of parallels, right, which goes across conservative governments all over the
Mm,
place. I also think it's interesting. I mean, that's the conservatives have never been about that. So I would say that Reaganomics, I mean, I don't know how much Margaret Thatcher. I know some about Margaret Thatcher. I don't know how much her sort of economic policy mimicked Reaganomics in that whole trickle down, the trickle down economy kind
yeah.
of way. Um, Brian Mulroney did it to some degree around that time, but not as much because he was more of a social. We had Brian Mulroney, even though he was with those people, was more of a social conservative than we have right now.
Mm,
Because what we see right now are people advocating this notion of freedom. I also believe, which it's not even the word freedom, doesn't even mean freedom anymore. It means just anarchy, which is different.
mm,
Anarchy, which is no rule, actually will impose less freedom on people because it allows people more insanity in their day. But what I find interesting, we're talking about a group of people that aren't educated enough. And I like to define between two kinds of people: ignorant, which I'm ignorant of a lot of things, boatloads of things. Economics, not my forte. I had a very lovely prof ask me never to take an economics class again because I just I kept challenging the human factor in economics, and he didn't want to. He's like, I can't with you. I'm like, yeah, but you can't with me because you refuse to admit that this game we've created it. So you keep saying it's the money, it's the system, it's this, it's that. We don't have. I'm like, no, dude, you drew up the rules. Like
mm-hmm.
in what I find interesting in the United States, and I wonder if this is going on in Britain right now too, and it's going on in Canada to some degree, is this notion, because back when Reagan was around, you had the increase of tuition, exponentially increase of higher education tuition, because they needed to find out a way to not allow so much of the population to get educated. And now what I'm seeing in the United States is the dismissal of higher education as a liberal uh, uh, as a liberal goal to indoctrinate and brainwash. You don't need any of that education. They're actually telling people education's garbage. Universities are garbage. They're liberal machines. Don't bother. So rather than making it economically, inaccessible, They're now trying to make it ideologically inaccessible. And what is their goal? Their goal is to keep people, a vast majority, ignorant. Because when I say stupid, Femi, I believe there are people on this planet, and I can't have conversation with them, that choose to remain ignorant. The day you choose, you're presented with the information, and you're like, nah, well, now
Hmm.
you're stupid. Now,
Yeah.
and I say that with all of the venom I can possibly. Now you're stupid. Now you've chosen, right? But I think the government, especially conservative governments who are looking to conserve, keep things the way they were, are looking to keep people ignorant. Do you have the same vibe over there?
Yeah, absolutely. And what you said about trickle down economics, and that hit me a lot because Boris Johnson, as I said, the idea was to work for the areas of the country that have been left behind, and yet Boris Johnson was supposedly the champion of this movement, and yet he's on record as saying a pound spent in Croydon, which is a part of London, is worth more to the country by sheer utilitarian calculus than a
Sure.
pound spent in Strathclyde, which is a much more rural part of the UK, up in Scotland. Now, and he says that in fact a pound spent in Croydon will actually end up helping Strathclyde. So it was
Oh,
trickle.
sure.
It was trickle north economics.
It was
Um,
trickle geography economics. We're going to
exactly.
spend more money in Florida, and it's going to help Michigan.
Yeah.
That's amazing logic he has there.
Exactly, and yet he's supposedly the champion of leveling up those parts of the countries that have been left behind. When he's one of the reasons why things are this bad. And you talked about sorry, what was it? What did you finish on? Sorry.
Just how we're undervaluing education. Initially, I
Yes,
think
education.
Reagan tried to make it economically inaccessible. Now we're making it ideologically unwanted, really.
Yes. So there's been a huge attack on academia via this particular populist conservative movement. For starters, you've got, I remember Nigel Farage, who was our biggest populist racist in the UK. He was actually celebrating that if we left the EU, we would lose the funding that we get via the EU for UK for universities. Yes, we're no longer free of the influence of the EU and the big money, blah blah blah. And then now you've got the government, the Tory government, trying to assign quote unquote free speech champions. And when you look at the document that they used to support this, they said that one of the problems in universities is this quote unquote chilling effect on different ideas. He said that it says that four out of ten Leave voters in university felt uncomfortable airing those views. Now, given that Brexit has objectively hurt the UK. The Office of Budgetary Responsibility, which is basically the economic brain of the UK government, the thing that the experts of government use to make their analysis, says that Brexit has damaged the UK economy twice as badly as COVID long term. So it is objectively a bad thing, and
Mm,
yet they're using the fact that four out of ten, so not even a majority of people who voted Leave, feel uncomfortable saying they support something that is objectively bad. And yet they're using that as an argument to say, oh, clearly universities are biased with this liberal agenda, therefore we're going to push things more in the other direction. So the acknowledgement of reality is seen as a bad thing.
right. Like, and it blows my mind. You know what I love TV, I love movies, and I don't know if you've ever seen the show Newsroom. Have you ever seen that show?
I think I've
It
seen a
was
couple
out
times.
it was out for a hand, like not a very many seasons. Why? Because I think it's talking about exactly what we're talking about right here, but they did it quite a few years ago. And the basis is there is a difference between equality uh, of ideas and healthy ideas being implemented into a system, whether you're talking about news or academia, and the same amount. So the idea in Newsroom was that, well, if you're a news station, you should agree with the Republicans 50% of the time, and you should
Mm,
agree with the Democrats 50% of the time. That's somehow unbiased. It's irrespective of the issue, irrespective of whatever issues either side are talking about. When in actuality, that's the opposite of I don't believe in objectivity. But that's the opposite of getting closer to objectivity, because objectivity looks at the issue, looks at the facts, makes a determination. And
Mm-hmm.
if it happens to follow more on the democratic ideological side, that's the way the cookie crumbles. We're not here to say the ideas have equal value. We're here, in academia especially, to analyze, criticize, pick apart, and then decide which ideas actually have merit and value, which ones should rise to the top, right? So and that's going on here. We have a guy named Jordan Peterson. Heaven help us.
Yeah.
Sorry. Look, Canada has some lovely exports. He's just not one of them.
Yeah.
But he's losing his mind, right? Because people are making him respect their pronouns, and this is the hill this man wants to die on. But it's not the hill he wants to die on. Because he's using it as that caveat, just like Trump, just like Boris has. He's using it as that wedge issue to get at people who don't understand the argument. He simplifies it, makes it about freedom, and somehow sells it back to the people. And Femi, this is the part where I sit here and I sweat because I get so frustrated, not at different perspectives, not at different ideas. I get so frustrated at the inability to have intellectual conversations that are drawn out, that aren't simplified. Because when I look at the right, the alt-right, not all people on the right-hand side of the aisle, what they do, and they do it horrifically well, is they simplify complex, important political, economic, and social issues to the bare minimum, weaponize them to incite, people to support them, and usually weaponize it with words like patriotism or nationalism or freedom and all of that kind of stuff. And the left, or the other side, or the rational parts of the world, are left standing there going, well, we can't fight on this level. Like, we can't even have a dialogue on this level because you've simplified it to such a stupid level that you're trying to blow up the conversation before it even starts. But most of the world reads the 140 characters on Twitter or listens to the minute TikTok, and they're done with it. I just want you to solve that issue for me today. It's just a small one.
Okay,
how does the left combat that?
So
I don't want to say the left. How do smart people combat that? Because it's not the left. Because they're smart people on all, in all sort of walks of life.
So with Jordan Peterson, I do have I've had some friends go down that pipeline, and
Yeah,
it's painful to watch, and so you have to basically just try and get to the end of the argument. So one of the biggest arguments that Jordan Peterson has done is around feminism and gender equality, and he'll make arguments along the lines of women choosing certain professions, etc., when working more at home, etc. But when you take it down to the end, you get to a place where, all right, women are putting in just as much work and labor during their day as men, and yet they end up with less financial power due to being paid less.
Yes.
That labor may be because they're working part time, maybe because they're working a different job that's lower paid, maybe because their labor is within the house. But either way, the same amount of effort is going in, and they're being paid less. And you think it's okay for women to have less financial power in a world with all of the problems that occur in relation to women, be they domestic violence, etc., violence against women, and the issues there, and you think it's okay to get less financial power for the same amount of work. Are you okay with that?
Yeah.
You are? Okay, you're a crappy person then.
Yes.
And you've got to take it right to the end and not allow them to make this, oh, well, they just choose. No, nobody chooses to be poor. Nobody makes that choice. Nobody chooses, I want to have less financial power. And the other thing that Jordan Peterson does is he will talk about the radical left. And he will only ever refer to the radical left. And he'll use that as if everybody on the left is the radical left.
Yes.
And that's how he tries to basically paint and turn any sort of leftist view will just automatically get shooed into that because that's all he ever talks about. And as for the oversimplification of issues, that happened has happened heavily over here. So, for example, on issues of on Brexit, it got there was actually several people who came up with slogans like
Perfect.
"Leave means leave," "Brexit
Yes.
means Brexit," and the irony of that is you're talking about going from our current relationship with the EU to literally any other one. So that's 1,000 pages of extra treaty. And the people who wanted Brexit wanted a specific kind of Brexit because we gave them many options, and they took to the streets with screaming Brexit betrayal with Theresa May's Brexit deal. They wanted something specific, but they claimed they were just like any kind of Brexit would do. It was an utter manipulation. It happens on trans issues. You'll get the right wing
Oh,
pundits who will constantly say, "Does a woman have a uterus?" And they won't
yeah.
make any distinction between sex and gender. They'll just say, no, no, answer the question, yes or no, yes or no, yes or no.
Yeah.
And it's designed to pit people against each other and avoid a rational discussion. It's
Hmm.
all just it's disgusting, but you can pick through it, and then as long as you just break it down to those levels. So, for example, with Jordan Peterson, take it to the end of the conversation. With trans issues, separate those issues. With Brexit,
Yeah.
say, all right, well, you don't want this kind of Brexit, so clearly it must be more complicated. You've got to just go to the end of that conversation and work there.
You know what? It's just so frustrating. Like going back to Ontario for a second, which is the province that I live in, and one of the things that our current government promised was to get rid of a just a cost that you had with your car. It doesn't matter what it is, and he's like, "Hey, you don't have to pay this $130 anymore, right? Every year for your car." And everybody's like, "Yay!" And God knows how many people voted for him because of it. Nobody. Why is it that nobody can make and by the way, the accumulation of that cost was like $1.2 billion. So he's just chucking $1.2 billion. And then everybody's like, why don't we have enough money for healthcare? They want raises? They want raises in schools? What, what is it about people that can't connect? I have my ideas that can't connect. You can't, and this is the fundamental flaw in conservative ideology. I promise you a better life, more social services, a better economic situation, and I'm going to ask you to pay less. Why is it a rational person can't go, that doesn't sound right. That sounds like magic. I don't know. How do we combat that?
I think it's because people tend to view the economy from just their own perspective.
Yeah.
So when they hear things like "we're going to raise taxes," even if they are at the economic bottom of society, earning say £12,000, and they hear someone like our potential new prime minister saying "we're going to cut taxes," oh, they're going to cut our taxes. Cool. What? No, wait, no, no, they're not going to cut taxes for you. They're going to cut taxes for the corporations. And so
Because
when
we
you, and then
trickle down. Don't worry, you'll
exactly.
get some eventually.
Exactly. And when they hear that Labour is going to raise taxes, they hear, oh, they're going to raise taxes on the working class. No, 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 no. They're going to raise taxes on the corporations. They're the
Mhm.
ones who can actually afford to pay the extra so that you can fund your public services. And so people, I think there's just a failure of messaging from the top as to being specific about who's actually going to benefit from what, who's going to pay the burdens of what, that sort of thing.
I'm trying to think. So I'm trying to think of the disaffected. I'm trying to think of the person who doesn't know economy, who's never studied politics, and to be honest, let's be honest, like could care less. You know what I mean? Like they're like, I don't care about. There's so many people who say I don't care about politics. They do. They just don't care about government because they're tired of being lied to. How do we get at them in a relatively simplistic but honest way? So when I have somebody promising I'm going to wipe away this tax cuz you don't deserve to pay it cuz that's brutal. How am I supposed to combat that simplicity of messaging with I only got 140 characters, Femi. I only got 30 seconds on TikTok. How do I combat that equally simplistically but somehow be actually honest about it?
Um,
Because I don't
so
know how else to get at those people.
So in terms of just the issue about I don't care about politics, when I was going around the country during the Brexit campaign years, I'd go into schools and I'd speak to 16, 17-year-olds and I'd
Hmm.
ask them who here cares about politics, and I get
Nobody.
maybe one hand go up out of 20. And so my next question is, okay, who here cares whether or not you can get a job when you leave school? Who here cares how much stuff
Oh,
costs in the shops? Who here cares whether or not you get treated in the National Health Service? And every single hand will go up, and I'll say that's politics. Now,
yeah,
these kids were arguably more politically aware than I was at their age, because
yeah,
I did not. For me, I was born up in the north of England. Politics was essentially old white rich men shouting at each other hundreds of miles away down in London. I did not
right.
see the connection between that and my life, and many people don't. And especially given how toxic politics has gotten over recent years, politics has, to a large extent, unless you're willing to really stick with it and sift through all the muck, it's just a big shouting match right now with lots and lots of insults. You need to make sure people see, no, this affects you. And so you need
Hmm.
to say, all right, we have, um, some people call it the politics of envy, but make the point that the money is there. We do
Hmm.
have the money in this country to make sure that everybody can get by. The UK is the fourth most financially unequal country in Europe. The money
Hmm.
is there to fix this problem and to make sure that you aren't, for example, this winter, freezing in your home because the energy price is going through the roof. So, and I think Labour in the UK is making quite a good go of it with the phrase a windfall tax on energy companies. Everybody can know them. Everybody knows they're making loads of profit. Everybody knows that the energy prices are too much. A windfall tax on energy companies to help you with your bills. Stuff like
Hmm.
that. Simple messaging saying, here's your problem, the bills. We're going to tax people who actually have loads of money to deal with that. Stuff like that.
Hmm. Well, I mean, that's what Biden just did, right?
Mm.
He's taxing anybody who makes over $400,000, and somehow the Republicans have switched it to be, oh my God, it's a tax on the middle class. And I'm like, I don't think anybody can be more simple than if you make more than $400,000 a year, this is your new tax bracket. And then there's new ones as you go up.
Yep.
If you were making $50,000, nobody's talking to you. Nobody's raising taxes on you. But somehow the Republicans are able to manipulate it and talk something weird about the IRS agents coming and not. No IRS agent is wasting their time at a guy's door who makes 50 grand a year. Not one. No, what are they doing? What?
Yeah.
That's what I want to know.
Yeah.
It's like nobody's coming to rob your house. Like, but it's just it's a mentality that has been so incredibly indoctrinated that now I don't even know how to get around it. You know what I mean? Like in the United States, you have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, heaven help us, Matt Getz. You have Lauren Boebert didn't even finish high school. Yet now she's sitting up and quoting economic theory she doesn't understand. But people are buying it. Do you have people in England and United Kingdom who are equally, what's the word I'm looking for? Conspiratorial, let's say. You have Marjorie Taylor Greene saying things like the Jewish population made space lasers and that's what started the forest fires in California. She
Of
said that
course.
out loud.
What
She
other
tweeted.
explanation could there be?
Yeah. Thank God she said. Somebody's going to go to that court and we're going to be in big trouble.
Yeah.
Do you have those people sitting in parliament right now?
um, in
Because I feel
Parliament,
like that's all I hear about in the United States.
yeah, the thing is, we've kind of managed to sidestep the Infowars level of things. Do you know we do have some of those channels. They don't make it into Parliament, but they do make it
Right.
into our media.
Right.
Um,
Sure.
and I do want to circle
What's
back to
his
what you
face?
said. Pardon?
Yeah. What's his face? What's your media guy that I want to slap upside his head?
Oh, Piers
He.
Morgan.
Thank you so much. Yes, your version of Tucker Carlson, but with an
Yeah,
accent, so we can
yeah.
hear. Yeah.
Oh, and trust me, there are now worse than him on the scene now. It's insane. We
Amazing.
do have a couple of people. I'm not sure you may have seen a clip of this guy called Mike Graham in the UK who he had an environmentalist on, and he asked the environmentalist what he did. He said he makes wood, and he said, but it's not good to be a carpenter and you're cutting down trees, or you can replant trees. He said, well, you can grow concrete. What? So that level of stupidity.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but I want to circle back to what you said about giving ideas equal value, because that's
Mm.
been a major problem. In fact, we had a one of our top journalists, Emily Maitlis, who was a major journalist for the BBC, who actually got pushed out of the BBC because she gave a speech during one of her programs about the former advisor to Boris Johnson who had broken lockdown rules, and she plainly
Oh yeah.
said he's broken the rules, and yet the Tories are still supporting them, and the public is horrified. And for that, because she didn't present the alternate view of what if he didn't break the rules, and what if the public
Right,
isn't horrified?
right.
Because the facts showed that the public
Yeah,
is horrified.
he
All the
did.
polling said it, and
Yes.
he did break the rules. And
Yep.
that is the and she talks about this notion of strategic bias, whereby
Yes.
media companies will, because when they try and report the truth, they'll get accused of bias because the truth makes either something or someone look bad, and so they'll overcorrect. They'll give
Yeah.
points of view that are utterly ridiculous. Like, and she gave the
Mm.
example of when she was interviewing Robert De Niro, who was talking about how Donald Trump was advocating people injecting disinfectant in order to fight COVID, and he was saying that was appalling. And she had her producer in her ear saying, "You need to push back on this. You need to present the other side." What's the other side? He said that stuff. It's mental.
That it's just, and it's that kind of insanity that is utterly breaking the system. And the best part about it is somehow the right, the alt right, is the one screaming that the left is doing it.
Yeah.
The the right is saying that we're only covering, these issues, like we're actually, the bias is actually to the left. And I'm just like, I don't even know how to have these conversations anymore about genuine issues, right? Like Trump has 300 documents that he took out of the White House. Initially he said, I declassified them, wherever the hell that means, and then the FBI took them, and he said, I didn't even, they weren't, I declassified them. And then he said, well, I want them back, but you planted them. I don't even know. How can you say so many things
Yeah.
out of your mouth? You type them. He doesn't stop himself because the idiot types them. How do you say so many inconsistent things? And people still go, you're right. You're right. I had this thing about Trump when he was in power, still to this day. I always thought he purposefully, not that I don't think he's an idiot, but he purposefully made grammatical mistakes in his tweets. He purposely would use the wrong there. He purposely would use the wrong too. And all the left would point it out because he's an idiot. But all of his followers went, I don't know the difference between those either. I like this guy. He's a man of the people, right? And it's
Yeah.
that kind of manipulation that is exhausting. But I don't know if you know about Ron DeSantis in Florida.
Uh,
He's trying to get the army to work in schools. Did you know this?
oh, is that like an anti mass shooting thing?
Oh, you think that could have been the way he spun it. In Florida, they've passed legislation basically saying we don't you the don't say gay bill. So basically, you can't talk about sexuality or gender when you go into classrooms, which
Mm.
is hilarious. How are you ever supposed to read a book with a mom or dad? But neither here nor there. So he's passed all this legislation to control the woke teacher, right? No more CRT. We're talking about the positive of the country, whatever. And then he's allowing parents to sue teachers, economically sue them. And so thousands of teachers have left Florida. So he has 6,000 teacher vacancy. And so what he's done is he's allowed military officers, given certain credentials, you have to have gone to college, you have to have a certain amount of time in the military, to step right in and start teaching. Because they'll teach the
Okay.
right way. They'll teach the right way. They're going to
Okay.
teach, right? They're going to teach math, science, English. They're going to teach whatever the right way is, whatever kind of brainwashing. And I'm like, and you have all these people clapping about it. And to me, that's the definition of a broken, at least state, if not country, because they're doing it a
Mm,
lot of different places, right? And we're talking about higher education. Well, now you're starting to see that attack come when it really does matter, in my opinion, way worse when the kids are in grade 3 or grade
mm,
7. Because that's, you want to brainwash? Don't wait for university. You don't. You do it.
yeah,
You do it when they're 10, 11, 12 years old, right? What
yeah.
is education like in Britain right now? Any of
We
those
do
issues?
have a degree. We do have a degree. I mean, there is talk about what age you start teaching about gender issues, sexuality
Right.
issues, and sex education in general. And that debate it's increasing. And I think given that we have a prime minister race going on right now. Some of them are definitely trying to attack what they would refer to as woke issues, to fuel a culture war sort of thing, and so they're definitely trying to stoke that fire. It's definitely coming up. It's weird enough. I was a little relieved when you said what you just said, because I thought you were about to tell me that they had the army in schools, so that if a teacher even uses a gender neutral pronoun, it's an immediate gun to the head. So what you
Listen,
said was bad, but I did breathe a sigh of relief.
give it a minute. Give it a minute.
Yeah.
Probably Texas might be closer to that reality. I'm
Yes,
not too
this is true.
sure.
This is true.
Um, but I think it's interesting. I mean, all of these factors join together. Now, a lot of people will ask me, and I'm going to ask you this sort of final kind of culmination, because we've talked about a lot of pretty horrible things. We talked a
Yeah.
lot about some horrible people pushing agendas and narratives to get them power, by any means necessary. And a lot of people will say to me, Joanna, is it getting worse? Because let's be honest, we had a nice little we have these ebbs and flows, right? And they're like, shouldn't we be progressing? Is it getting worse? Why are we going backwards? I have my answer to that. What do you think?
I'd say it's getting worse because, well, certainly in the UK, it's getting worse because the bad people are still in power. In
Mm-hmm.
America, it's getting worse largely because A, we're still in the middle of an economic crisis, B, because Donald Trump's parting shot was a big one with Roe v. Wade packing the Supreme Court.
Three Supreme
Um,
Court.
um, but you at least have the hope of things getting better, because even though Biden isn't exactly what we all hoped he might be, he's at least not Trump. And so you can hopefully get somebody better next time. Um, However, I often, because obviously things aren't going so well in the UK, our people struggle to keep hope and not get too depressed by this and not turn off. But I remind people this is why you need to have hope. And it's
Yeah.
because in the UK, and we talked about the voting system at the start, the majority always votes for parties to the left of the Conservatives. So we are, compared to the Conservatives, a progressive voting country, and yet we keep having Conservatives. They've been in power for 47 of the last 47 of the last 77 years. So they get the
Right.
majority of power, but even though the majority doesn't want them. And
Yeah.
at some point, it has to happen that the parties on the left of the Tories will at some point work together when they realise that if they want the votes to actually count properly, they need to work together. Because as it currently stands, as I said, the Tories got 56% of the seats based off only 44% of the votes, which means that Tory votes, Conservative votes, actually count 18 times more than Green votes. And so, of course, Greens don't get a large vote share because people know their votes won't count. And so you'll
Yeah.
actually get better politics when we once change the system. And when that happens, we once we change the voting system to a proportional system of voting, the Tories, the Conservatives, will be effectively locked out of absolute power for good. And so I often quote Martin Luther King, who said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We will ultimately get to what he would call the promised land, but it's going to take some time, and it's going to need proper leadership from the parties in opposition who currently see opposing each other as more important. And we need people that actually care about representing the progressive majority in the UK.
You know what? I'm not even going to give my opinion because I think that was a perfect answer. I think that was plus you had the Martin Luther King quote. I can't follow that. But I think but I think that's the perfect answer. And I think that the more people that get involved and social media, everybody thinks is this horrible, can be this horrible thing. But holy crap, I'm sitting here talking to an incredibly influential, amazing activist, thousands of
Ditto.
kilometers away in another country. And we're this close to each other. And
Mm,
hopefully the more people like that connect in this world, forget just where you live and the town you live in, the country you live in, right? We have an
mm.
interconnectivity now where, and I truly believe this, there are more amazing, caring, empathetic, rational people on this planet than not. The people that aren't just seem to have the microphone right now,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And I've been so inspired by the number of people who have been inspired to get involved
Mhm.
since 2016. Everybody's realized that the guy at the wheel is drunk. Everybody
Mhm.
in the UK, and so you've seen so many creators just come out of the woodworks and become activists because they realize, oh shit, if we don't do something, nobody will. And so
Right.
you've had a lot of people come out and say and make their platforms and push back against it, and it's really inspiring to see the number of people who come onto the stage because of this. I mean, I got created because of the absence of leadership, of facts, of objectivity in the Brexit discussion. Because if you think about where I was at the start of 2016, I had 20 followers on Twitter. I was living 400 miles away in Brussels. I barely
Wow.
knew anything about UK politics. I was working on human rights at the EU level. That's what my career is. I have a law degree. I was working on human rights in the EU institutions, and it was only because I realised that Brexit was a threat to the EU, to the human rights of the UK, which it
Mhm.
clearly has been because of all the stuff that Boris Johnson has done since. That I started to pay attention and realize, hang on, nobody's explaining this stuff properly. And so, despite having 20 followers on Twitter back then, I've got now close on 400,000 now because
Yeah,
people
that's right.
realized that the mainstream media was not telling us what we needed to hear. Because of that
Mhm.
problem of them believing they have to show both sides as if they're equal, as if they have equal value. I often say that the BBC's definition of balance is presenting the pros and cons of drinking arsenic as if they're equal.
Femi, you're amazing. Can you please come back on? I know we were going to talk about media initially, but I think this was a super important conversation. Can you
Absolutely,
please come back on another time? And so
100%.
we can talk about, we can give all of our attention to the media because I think it's incredibly important to talk about where it is, where it sits, the difference between public and private media, how much it
Mm,
relies on advertising, how much money plays into the equation. I would love to have you come back so we can have that discussion.
absolutely.
Thank you. And I thank you for, I want you to stick around though. When I stop recording, I want you to stick around because I have a couple of off camera things I need to say. Um, but I want to thank you so much for coming. Everybody, I will put Femi's contact stuff all in the bio here so you can go find him on Twitter and anywhere else that you tell me you would like to be found. Maybe you want to give a shout out to the people right now and let them know where they can find you.
I'm Femi_Sorry on everything: TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and I'm Femi.Sorry on Facebook because it was already taken.
Amazing. I thank you so much and thank my listeners and my watchers for watching. I will see you next Tuesday. Same bat time, same bat station. Dismissed.